This Guy's Garage. Like and subscribe.
After your appearance at the Government Operations and Estimates Committee, Mr. Jeglick, the Auditor General tabled her report, and in it she found that GC Strategies was actually involved in the development of the criteria for the contract, which in your report you termed, and you mentioned it again today, overly restrictive and favored this existing CBSA supplier. 2 weeks ago, I sent your office a letter regarding this new discovery from the Auditor General's report related to the $25.3 million contract awarded to GC Strategies back in May of 2022. And as I indicated in my letter, I would like your office, you yourself, to investigate these findings and verify who allowed this private contractor to actually sit at the table and develop the criteria for a contract that they were obviously going to win. Will you undertake to investigate these findings and table the results with this committee?
So, Mr. Chair, thank you for the question and thank you for the letter. In addition to your letter, there was also the commitment made to the OGO chair that we would follow up in terms of looking at bait and switch more broadly. And so these are ongoing discussions within the office. As I've mentioned at committee, one of the factors that we must consider is reasonable grounds and who is best situated ultimately to conduct the review. I must admit we were troubled by that additional disclosure made in the OAG report, and we're trying to determine whether we're best positioned to conduct a secondary analysis or if there are other authorities who are better placed to do that analysis. But we will certainly respond to your letter in due course, and again, I appreciate the fact that you followed up, so thank you.
You're welcome. In regards to, I think what we heard for the first time at committee from you was the whole idea of bait and switch when it comes to task authorizations, identified resources being switched out. Of course, we've been given the reasoning at times that given the time that a project is, an RFP is put out and the project actually begins, some resources may not be available. But in your report, you noted 76% of resources did actually do no work as identified in those task authorizations. Is there an audit, or was there an audit done, or should there be an audit done to determine if, in fact, these resources were at the same skill level or higher, or whether or not they were actually below?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So that's essentially what I alluded to in the department. In the first answer is that is absolutely something we're considering doing, not just specific to ArriveCan, but on a much broader scale to determine how prevalent the practice is. As mentioned at the OGO committee, the fact that it has that is indicative of it's a troubling practice. And I have to admit also, upon reconsideration, I'm even more troubled by the percentage of 76%. And so it's something I'd happily discuss in further answers.
Thank you very much. In your report, you also described the alarming lack of documentation across the ArriveCan contracts. Was there a specific department that was responsible for documentation that failed to collect and file it, or was this a problem across the departments mentioned, the CBSA, PSPC, and PHAC?
So I think a fair answer is that there was documentation issues across all. I will also say that we've recently conducted procurement practice reviews of all three of those departments and seen prevalent documentation issues that extend beyond the ArriveCan. So as a result, we will be following up, and I'll mention this again at this committee, we do follow up on all of our reports 2 years after to determine whether in fact the recommendations were implemented. And so we did make a recommendation to the CBSA in relation to documentation practices, which we intend to follow up on shortly. So that will address CBSA, and again, PSPC and shared services equally have recommendations made associated with documentation practices, which we intend to follow up on.
Thank you.
You 1 minute.
1 minute, great. Just following up on the recommendations, we have obviously heard departments rightly saying we accept the recommendations that have been made by the procurement ombuds and the auditor general to make improvements to those processes. I think we've even seen some answers to those recommendations. But have you seen anything put in place that will actually ensure that what happened with ArriveCan never happens again?
So I think I'll piggyback off of the last question around documentation, because that's the first issue that needs to be addressed immediately. I have witnessed some direct implications to the ArriveCan recommendations, meaning witnesses appearing before this committee and other committees speaking to their commitment to make changes immediately and that are already impacting change.
Today, the RCMP commissioner has confirmed that the police are investigating the ArriveScam scandal. We're increasingly seeing that the NDP Liberal government's ArriveScam scandal was costly, was corrupt, and also was criminal. I want to start with questions to the Auditor General. And I'm perplexed by the fact that Liberals are laughing in response to this line of questions. There's nothing funny about this. $60 million that was wasted of taxpayers' money, corruption, bid rigging, RCMP investigations. I'm sorry, there's just nothing funny about this at all, and I think people that are struggling under the burden of taxes that are paid for this kind of waste and corruption don't find it funny either. But anyways, to the Auditor General, have you communicated with the RCMP? Have they asked for documentation? What kind of information have you been able to provide them?
Thank you. Before our report was submitted to Parliament on the 12th of February, we had spoken with the RCMP to make them aware that our report was coming. We did signal to the RCMP at that time that if they were interested in receiving information from us, that we would be happy to share it in response to a production order. And we wrote to the RCMP afterwards confirming the same.
Okay, thank you. Similar question for the procurement ombudsman. Have you communicated with the RCMP? Have you been providing information in relation to your work and your findings?
So we have not had any communication with the RCMP. At the time that it became public information that the RCMP may consider investigating, it was at that point we considered what the appropriate steps would be. We felt the best thing we could do was put our report on the public record as quickly as possible so that information could be made known to the RCMP. And we made comments to that effect also before the OGO committee.
Okay, thank you. Sticking with procurement ombudsman, were you surprised by the RCMP announcement today based on the work you've done?
So I just want to answer this as factually as possible. So it's in addition to everything else that we've learned. So based on the information contained in our report and the documentation that we saw, I would answer yes, I'm surprised. However, based on all of the other additional information, including information that was provided by the OAG, I'm not surprised.
Okay. So in light of everything you know at this point, you're not surprised by the investigation?
Right. I'm reluctant to say anything that we didn't review. It's difficult for me to have a view on because I didn't do the review. So that's why I said the comment in the way that I did. Certainly, we rely heavily on the work of the OAG. And so where there's factual findings that there were communications between the supplier and the department that led to the supplier ultimately providing restrictive criteria is highly troubling.
Yeah, highly troubling in the sense that it wouldn't surprise you that the RCMP would be investigating that.
Correct.
Yeah. Back to the Auditor General's team. Were you surprised by the confirmation from the RCMP today, or not surprised based on what you know so far?
Based on the fact that the RCMP had already signaled that they were examining the allegations raised by Bottler that involved many of the similar individuals that were involved in ArriveCan, it's not surprising to me that they would take a broader look at the matters before them.
Okay. Both of your reports dealt with rigging of the process in different ways, actually. But I think we see at various points a kind of rigging of the process in GC Strategy's favor. Would the rigging that your reports identified constitute criminal activity?
I think I'll start with this one. The concerns that we raised were really about public servants undertaking activities that gave GC strategies an advantage, whether it's in the non-competitive context where the GC strategies hadn't even provided a proposal but won that first contract, or whether it's in the competitive process where there was in GC strategies involvement in setting the requirements. Those to us are concerns. It raises questions about whether or not there was bias or unfair advantage, but whether it's criminal, that's really a matter for the RCMP.
Okay, would you like to comment on whether the rigging component specifically appears to
I will
be criminal
kind
issue?
of answer in the same way that my colleague finished, which is now that there actually is an investigation, I think any kind of commentary around criminality is inappropriate. Let the RCMP make that determination.
To Mr. Jeglick, would you expect ministers to be briefed on large procurement items like this? Is that part of the best practice? Is it plausible that this process could have unfolded with no ministers knowing anything? And did you find evidence about the inclusion of ministers or their staff in these conversations?
So I would say the involvement of political actors in the procurement process is problematic, right? So there should be no involvement from political actors. Once a procurement process is set in motion, it's very important to follow the rules set out. So if there's an evaluation process that ultimately is designed to determine who the successful supplier is, there should be no involvement from political actors. In terms of external briefings, I would hope that those briefings would happen in such a way that there is no direct involvement of any politician in an active procurement process.
So that's the best practice you described, what should happen. I guess in this case, the absence of records makes it hard to know what did happen. Or do you have any insight on whether best practice was followed here?
So what I can say is, yes, you're correct in the fact that there's documentation missing, but we saw no evidence of any political actors interfering in any of the procurements based on the documentation that we were able to see.
Okay, so based on what you're able to see, basically, but the absence of documentation makes it uncertain.
Right. Sorry.
Yeah. Oh, so just you can tell me, is that correct?
No, I was going to say yes, absolutely.
Okay. So as we go through this process, we are finding out more based on your reports about what happened, when it happened, where. There remains a gap as to why. Why were documents either not created or destroyed? Why were processes rigged? Why was there such a desire within government to fit the square peg of GC strategies into this round hole, which was an IT project that they had no expertise on? Do you have any reflections based on the work you did about why the government proceeded in this fashion? I'd be curious to hear from both you, Mr. Jeglick, and the Auditor General's office.
So again, that's the troubling component in that you cannot come to a conclusion as to why certain things were done. And that's, I guess, I'm sure I share the frustration in the Auditor General's perspective as well, in that the findings are difficult to make where you don't have sufficient information to be able to have a finding. The observations we made and the recommendations associated with those observations and findings were based on the documentation that was available. Certainly, we do spend time trying to identify what possible issues could have arisen, even specific to that $25.2 million contract that was awarded to GC Strategies. I think there were some abnormalities that still warrant further discussion, right? So what was disclosed in the Auditor General's report was something that we weren't aware of, that the supplier was involved in developing these restrictive criteria. But then at the same time, we also noted that there were 40 participants that were eligible and 10 identified an interest in participating in in the process. So it's a little bit unclear as to why none of those 10 parties participated in the process, even though they identified having an interest in participating. So again, there's a question there in our minds that remains unanswered. And so
somebody did something here that was totally wrong. We don't know why. They must have had a reason, but we don't know why. I'm going to give the tail end of my time here to Ms. Block, who had a follow-up question.
About 40 seconds.
Yes, and it probably segues quite well with what my colleague was just asking. I just want to make sure, Mr. Jeglick, that I understood your response to my question regarding the correspondence I sent to your office. And even in your answer just now, are you confirming that the AG's report and the findings regarding GC strategies means that this remains an open file for further discussion or investigation with your office?
So our report is considered final. However, there are ongoing discussions within the office on components of the report that we're still looking into. So your letter did prompt further discussions as to additional facts that have been made aware to us after finalization of the report. Whether that generates a whole secondary review, that I can't comment on yet because we've not done the analysis. But I will say, and as I answered before, there is that and the secondary issue of the bait and switch review that we're also actively contemplating. That would
Thank you. I'm going to.
Throughout the course of our study on ArriveCAN, we have identified what I would say are extensive issues with scrutinizing subcontractors. In fact, we've learned from departments that the scrutiny of subcontractors is far less than those of contractors. And the Office of the Auditor General made it very clear to us at their appearance at OGO that their mandate restricts their ability to audit subcontractors, especially relating to value for money. So my question to you would be, is this an issue that concerns you, the inability to scrutinize, perhaps even the volume of times that subcontractors are used? And do you have the ability to make any recommendations for how to implement more oversight of subcontractors in government contracts?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'll answer the question kind of backwards in the sense that we hear from subcontractors, specifically within our office, about issues that they're experiencing with the prime, looking for our services in hopes that we can help them. Unfortunately, we cannot. We have similar limitations to that of the OAG. That being said, and again, I didn't make this recommendation, but I will say by listening to much of the testimony here and that before the OGO committee, I do think there is a need for more transparency associated with monies that are from the federal purse that flow down to subcontractors. And I understand there's obviously privity of contract issues associated with information shared between the primes and subcontractors and subcontractors. But I do think that when you're involved in federal government contracting, there is an obligation of transparency. So while I couldn't make that recommendation because it wasn't appropriate given the parties subjected to this review, it's certainly an issue that I think warrants a significant analysis as to whether A, it's possible, but B, I do think it would help address some of the issues that we're seeing.
Now to Mr. Hayes and the Office of the Auditor General. At a previous meeting, I noted that the Auditor General's report mentioned that CBSA had added a firm to a task authorization under GC strategies rather than contracting the firm directly. And when I asked if you knew who that firm was at the time, you didn't, but then you actually provided me with the answer at the very end of the meeting, and I think it was KPMG was the firm that had been added to a task authorization form of GC strategies. And since this company was not approached to do the work, it was added to a task authorization form and became a subcontractor for GC strategies. Were you able to determine the value for money of their work? And I'm suspecting maybe not, because they were now a subcontractor. And can you comment on whether or not it would have been cheaper for CBSA to contract this firm directly rather than making them a subcontractor to GC Strategies? And doesn't that have the appearance of providing GC Strategies with an additional cut for the work that was done by this resource?
Sorry. What I would say about that, it was a confusing situation, quite frankly. Having a subcontractor that the agency identified put through the GC Strategies contract means that the terms and conditions of that contract with GC Strategies would apply, meaning that they would get their finder's fee for having a subcontractor, even though it was the agency that identified that resource. So ultimately, I think to the nub of your question, it costs more because they shouldn't have had to pay for GC Strategies' portion of that. They could have just paid KPMG for that if they put a contract directly in place with KPMG.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Block. Turning out to Ms. Bradford, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
I was speaking in the House today on this issue, and it's evident from the evaluations of both of your offices that there is very little positive, if anything at all, to say about the Arrive CAN application. So again, I just thank you both very much for your work. Mr. Jellick, in November of 2021, you had a report on the CBSA, and you stated in the report, your office, the OPO, observed instances where CBSA failed to disqualify non-compliant bids and awarded at least one contract to a non-compliant bidder. File documentation was also found to be incomplete and significant concern, in several files. You recommended that they need to document every decision of business value, and the CBSA agreed to do this by June of 2022. And certainly there's a lot of water under the bridge since then. So based on this most recent report of yours, do you feel that these recommendations were followed or not?
Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. I'm sure the CBSA is not looking forward to our follow-up review because one of the things we will be looking at is specifically that recommendation about documentation. Now, that being said, the scope period was slightly different, obviously, for that review. It was 2018 to 2020. That being said, that predates the pandemic, right? And so this identifies the seriousness of the documentation deficiencies at the CBSA. And also in that report, thank you for bringing it up, you'll note that we identify the seriousness associated with the issue, and we specifically say the procurement file documentation was incomplete and of significant concern, right? And so this is back in 2021 that this was ultimately released, and I can give you the specific date. It was November 9th, 2021. So to say that they were unaware of their documentation practices, I think would be inappropriate. What I think the work of this committee and the work of other committees has done is it's elevated the importance of my office and the work done by the Office of the Procurement Ombuds. And I think not to say that the recommendations were not taken seriously, because they were, but I think there's an additional enhanced scrutiny associated with the work of our office by parliamentary committees, which I think will result in stronger and swifter action.
That's excellent news, and I'm actually very as well pleased to see your office elevated in terms of heeding advice and information, as well as your colleagues to the left of you there. So we saw a lack of documentation in 3 different agencies: the Canada Border Services Agency, Public Health Agency of Canada, and Public Services and Procurement of Canada, you mentioned a lack of compliance. How do you think then that compliance is ensured?
So, Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. The way we ensure compliance is by conducting follow-up reviews. So We do allow for the elapsing of 2 years, and we find that to be a sufficient amount of time to allow departments and agencies to react to the recommendations being made. And then we do a secondary review. The nature of the review depends on what we see, but it is something that we specifically contemplate doing, and then we issue report cards that will speak to whether the recommendation has been complied with or not.
And I have said several times in both live broadcasts as well as within the House that to me the most concerning thing about ArriveScan is that I believe that it's a microcosm of how this government has operated, everything from the mismanagement to the lack of oversight. In your opinion, is the lack of documentation a systemic issue throughout all of the federal departments, or would it be specific to these departments based on your analysis?
Thank you for the question. So again, when I talk about baseline data, this is one area where we do have baseline data, and I would suggest that we've done over 17 reviews of departments and agencies in terms of the highest value and volume departments and agencies. And I would say the number one, if not 1A, maybe 1B issue is documentation. So this is not unique to these three departments. This is a struggle across the federal government. And I think that this is something that needs to be taken seriously. And like I said, I think the work of this committee and the OGO committee spotlighting the seriousness of the documentation deficiencies will work to actively and rapidly address the deficiency.
What's going to happen? Like, there seems to be a clear case of negligence in the least. Is there any ramifications for the people involved in making these decisions? If at some point we find the RCMP, I guess, criminal charges, but we've had people come here and say, well, I wasn't in the job before. What happens? What is a possible remedy for some of the people that were in these jobs and made some of these decisions?
I think there's a number of angles to that. There's a few processes that are underway, whether they are the internal investigation at CBSA. The RCMP is looking into allegations. We've had members of the senior public service speak about the fact that bonuses can be retracted if it's justified. And I believe that officials from the Public Service and Procurement Canada talked about possible recovery of amounts. Whether that can be achieved on the information that's available is an open question, but those are some of the recourses that may be available.